Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this month's Portals Community Call. I'm Jason Gumpert from MS Dynamics World. I am pleased to be able to host this event and introduce our regular host or main host, important host, person we couldn't do this without, Nick Hayduk. He is here and he is going to present. As we get started, as always, we do welcome your questions. Nick will make time for those throughout the event. Look for the questions block in the webcast interface. You can enter your questions, comments, witty comebacks to Nick's information, really anything that that comes to mind that you want to share with the group, and we will be looking for those. We are also recording today's event. We'll be making it available on demand soon after we conclude, and if you go back through, we have a whole library of these going back well over a year, a whole lot of them that you can browse as well. So without any further delay, Nick, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, welcome everyone. Glad to see that there's a few people who are interested in knowing about how to avoid disappointing Power Apps Portals projects. So yeah, let's, I guess, get into it. Why isn't my slide? There we go. Yeah, so my name is Nicholas Hayduk. If you haven't had the chance to join one of our calls yet, quick introduction. I'm the president and software engineer with Engineered Code Consulting, Inc., based here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. Microsoft MVP with 12 years now, working with Power Apps Portals, which started off with ADX Studios, which is the company I started my career with. If you aren't already, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. You can check out my Twitter, the blog, the YouTube channel, where we're putting out something every week, as well as the Refresh the Cache podcast. And yeah, feel free to engage with me on social using any of those channels. As always, I want to thank Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World for hosting us and helping us get the word out and helping me pay attention to the questions that people ask. So I'm glad that we continue this partnership that's now almost 2 years old now. We started this in January of 2020. So we're almost, we're getting close to year number 3, so looking forward to that. All right, the agenda, as always, will cover what's kind of new over the last month or so with portals. Then we'll get into today's topic, which is 10 things you need to know to avoid a disappointing Power Apps Portals project. It's a bit of a mouthful, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the things where I find that sometimes the product doesn't meet expectations. Not that the expectations are too high and the portals can't do it. It's just that people think one thing and they get in there and it turns out to be something else, and that just leads to disappointment. So I thought if we could bust some of those myths, that there might be just more happy people out there and people who are using the product in the right situation. And then, as always, if there's any questions, whether it's throughout the presentation or at the end there, we'll try and leave some time for Q&A. I think we might have some extra time today. I'm not sure how long it's going to take me to get through my 10 things, but this one might be a quicker one today. We'll see. In terms of news, the big one that I hope to never have to be asked about again is multi-select. The one thing people may not realize is that the release plans that Microsoft puts out, they're usually kind of a big bang release one day, everyone goes and reads all the notes, but it turns out that Microsoft updates those throughout the release wave as well. So I noticed a couple things when I was prepping for my sessions at the Dynamic Community Summit that happened last week in Houston, where I was ventured onto an airplane for the first time in almost a couple of years now. So I headed out of country, got all my testing done, and headed down to Houston for the week. And so I had a few sessions there, got to meet some old friends and see some faces I haven't seen in a while. So while I was prepping for those calls, I noticed that there were some new things in the release plan that weren't there when they were first announced. So the first one being multi-select. So it looks like Microsoft is working on having multi-select available, support for those on forms, and I guess they would show up in views and that sort of thing. So on basic forms, advanced forms, lists, we are going to get multi-select support. So that's very exciting. I know that there's many projects where we've implemented a workaround. I've got a couple blog posts on a workaround for it, but it's not pretty. So I'll be happy to turn those off once the multi-select support is there. So that is fantastic news that portals will support multi-select. And I hope this means that we can start looking for, because there are some other column types that still aren't there. The file type, which we'll talk about next here. So I hope that means that we're going to start seeing some of those items added as support into those into the forms and list capabilities. So very exciting that we should see a multi-select here. I want to say it was December timeframe, but yeah, at some point here we should see the multi-select light up on your forms and your lists. The next one here, which is the use of web files. Currently, web files, if you were to upload a file to your web file, that they have to be as a note or the underlying annotation entity or table. So what Microsoft has announced is that rather than going to the notes, and that can cause some confusion using the notes because you can have many notes. So it's like, which ones does it pick? I believe the logic is it usually picks the most recent one, but it just kind of leads to some confusion. So what they're doing is they're moving towards using the new file column type. So rather than looking at associated notes to the web file, they are going to add another column to the web file table, and that will be of type file. And so you will that's where it will be. That's where it will store the file for the web file. I believe that the notes talked about some sort of transition process, so that if you're still using annotations, they will do the work to move those into the file column. So that's also very interesting news. And I'm hoping, because they're doing work with the file column, that might mean good things about getting file column support on a form. I know that would be a pretty big deal, because I know that when people talk about uploading files to the portal, it's always either through SharePoint or Notes, and it's just not as structured as people would like it to be. So people like to say, hey, I uploaded a file for this specific purpose, but right now you're kind of stuck with, well, I uploaded a note or I uploaded something to SharePoint, and it's not, you can't say, hey, I uploaded this document, or to meet this particular requirement and have logic that runs on that. It's just always in those associated records, and that's just not as nice as it could be. So hopefully that this means that now they're starting to dive into file column support, that we might see it on those forms as well. The other thing that I don't think I'd mentioned last month, I'm not exactly sure when this all came out, but the use of deployment profiles in the Power Apps CLI, the command line interface within that you can use within, say, PowerShell. Deployment profiles are a way of having settings that are specific to a particular environment as part of your the new Power Apps CLI. The ability to essentially download and upload data from your portal. So I think I demoed this in one of our calls, but if you're not familiar with the new, there's the PA portals command or switch in the Power Apps CLI that has a number of different portals features. You can list the portals, you can, but most importantly is you can download the data associated with the portal, and then you can upload it back. So that's good for ALM processes where you want to move data between environments. But sometimes there are settings that change between environments. So for example, often the settings associated with authentication will have client IDs and that sort of thing that are different per, you have a dev environment, you have your UAT environment. Those will have different configurations because hopefully you have different setups for authentication in those different environments. So if you just were to export everything and then import everything and move that between environments, you're going to be overriding site settings and other things that you may not want to change. So with deployment profiles, essentially there's a syntax that allows you to specify and to overwrite the values of site settings and other types of records, where when you do an import to a particular environment based on your deployment profiles, it won't update those fields or those particular rows. So this allows you, it's just a maturation of the ALM possibilities with the Power Apps CLI. So If you check out Alexander's post on that, Dancing with CRM is Alexander Lashin's another MVP who does a lot of portal stuff. You can check out his blog post where he talks about that as well. So I see a question here from Jim. Jim, thanks for your question. File column support for CDN endpoint. I haven't heard of anything like that. That would be, trying to think here. So with the file column, if we're talking about the web files, then I don't think that there's anything about a CDN endpoint in there. You can always host your files on a CDN and link to them from your portal, but I haven't heard anything specifically about content delivery networks for that have to do with the file column. So sorry, I have nothing to share on that point. Okay, that was what I wanted to cover on the news side of things. So why don't we move on to today's topic, which is 10 things you need to know to avoid a disappointing Power Apps Portals project. So obviously, I'm probably biased. I think Power Apps Portals are great, but that doesn't mean they're perfect in every single situation. And as a person who runs a company where we help people with portals implementations, we often get brought in when their expectations or their clients' expectations are not being met. So we do end up with a lot of projects where people say, you know, I expected X, but I'm getting Y. You know, are we doing it wrong? You know, what are we missing? And I found in my experience that it's almost always because of bad assumptions. It's a case of someone saying, well, I know that this thing did that, so it must also be this way in portals. You know, often it would be like, well, I could do that in Canvas apps. That's a Power App. Power Apps Portals is a Power App. I must be able to do the same thing. So, or, you know, I saw that, you know, the first one that we'll get into is SharePoint. So, oh, I saw that it worked in the old ADX Studio that way. It must work the same way in Power Apps Portals. So too often people are making assumptions about the functionality that they expect out of Power Apps Portals, and it leads to, it's not even that you could achieve what they wanted, but they go in with certain expectations, and even if they're not, even if you can come up with a way that solves their business challenges, they're left with this disappointing feeling because it wasn't what they expected. So what I'm hoping to do is just kind of bring up some of those points today so that people are a little bit more clear, or they know which areas where, if, you know, a particular requirement comes up, and again, I'll go back to the SharePoint example. If someone comes in and says, hey, I need you to work with SharePoint, you know, often people will be like, yeah, great, Power Apps Portals works with SharePoint, no problem. And which is true, but there's often very specific ways that they're hoping that it works, and Portals does it in one specific way. So you get into there and say, yes, check, it has SharePoint support, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to support SharePoint in the exact way that you want. So today we're going to be going over the 10 things that I kind of thought of that are the areas where people come to me, and you know, if we could have just talked at the beginning, we could have avoided some disappointments. So let's get started. So the first one is SharePoint. I would say, I don't know, I'm going to make up a stat here, but like 50% of the time people come to us, and SharePoint is a huge part of what they're looking for from a portal. And whether it's SharePoint or whether it's how files are handled, often there's a requirement to upload some sort of documents to the portal. That's kind of why I'm excited to hopefully see that there'll be the file type maybe introduced, because that will help us address some of those challenges. But again, often we just see people are using SharePoint, and SharePoint is really good at making it simple to share things with guests. I mean, the licensing is, you know, there's no real additional licensing cost to give people access to SharePoint. So it's like they're expecting, oh, I've got a portal, so I'm going to get all the features that I get out of portal or out of SharePoint, but just on my portal. And unfortunately, that's just not really the case. The SharePoint integration is a very specific, it's done in a very specific way. And there's really not a ton of flexibility in it. People will say, oh, I want to be able to change the columns that I see or have multiple document locations. There's all these things that they wish it did, but really it's more like once you set it up, there's only, I'm trying to think of how many settings there are that actually allow you to configure the SharePoint. So beyond just the permissions, which you can have it like read only versus edit and add, the only other setting that kind of comes to the top of my mind is controlling the size of the files that you can upload. And there is a specific setting for that. But beyond that, it's important to understand what the SharePoint integration gives you, because there is just not a whole lot of ways that you can modify how it works. So it's important to understand that the SharePoint integration is really built on top of the integration that exists within Dataverse, Model-Driven Apps, Dynamics 365. So if you're not familiar with that within Dynamics, records can have what's called a document location, which is associated with a record in Dynamics. And essentially what that document location record is it literally has a text field on it that says, what is the folder in SharePoint that corresponds to this record? And that's it. No actual documents obviously are stored in Dynamics because they're stored in SharePoint. So all that's really stored in Dataverse is the string file path that points to the location in SharePoint. So Power Apps Portals is built on that. So when you have a record, it will have a document location and it will point to a single folder in SharePoint. And those are the files and folders that are within that folder are what are shown on your Power Apps portal. So it doesn't do things like, what if you have 2 document locations associated with your record? Well, I think the way the code is written, it will pull the one that was created first, but even that's like probably just a result of the way the code was written, and I don't know if it was on purpose. So really the assumption is that when you're working with records and SharePoint, that your records will only have a single document location. Well, what if you want to have some documents that are private and some that are on the portal? Well, that can get challenging. We've come up with some kind of crazy workarounds where we relate to other records and that sort of thing. But in essence, what it gives you is a pretty simple model where you have a record, you have a single document location associated with that record, and whatever files are in that particular folder and subfolders are what are displayed on the portal. And that's pretty much it. It will then show you the list of those documents on the portal. You don't really have the ability to add extra kind of metadata. You can't, when you upload, add metadata. You can't really configure the columns that are shown in that list view of SharePoint documents. The best you can do is you can hide some if you don't want it, because we can just hide those with JavaScript and CSS, but you can't add extra columns. There's not a ton that you can actually do when it's in there. The other thing is that the permissions are relatively complex to set up. You have to set up permissions on the document location entity. It can be a bit confusing because when you actually add the subgrid to the form that you want it to show on, you have to actually show the document. You have to do the document location subgrid and not documents, which seems like it would be a little bit more intuitive, but it's the document locations. And then because of the inherent limitation of there being 10 link entities in a single fetch XML, if you start having SharePoint turned on too many entities, you're going to quickly reach the limit. So if you have a few different complex table permissions and you want SharePoint to be turned on 3 or 4 different record types on different tables, you can quickly run into the limitation on SharePoint or the limitation in fetch XML where it can't enforce the permissions properly. So that's kind of the challenge with SharePoint, is that it's relatively easy to get set up if you can just follow the instructions, and if that's what you want, great. But if you want to change it anyway, it's not overly flexible. Okay, got a question here from Jim. Can we change the document location value in any way? For example, we'd like to use a separate site teams channel for each entity. So another limitation is that the portal is expecting that you are using the default site. So when you set up the SharePoint integration, there's a default site. So in terms of the document location, as long as it's attached to it ends up being attached to the default site, the thing to remember is, as I stated earlier, all that really matters is that there's a field, it's a text field that contains the folder location, and the way that the Dynamics kind of does this out of the box is that every different folder gets its own document location entity, and so you can kind of get this hierarchy of the file structure. But you can pre-create your own your own folder structure using document locations. So you are not tied necessarily to the folder structure that Dynamics uses out of the box, which will often be like, you kind of get the root of your document collection, and then you go / the name of the entity / the ID of the record, and that will be where it puts it. If you rely on the portal to create those document locations, that's what you'll get. But if you create a record and pre-create the document location, both creating the document location and the underlying SharePoint, if that record already exists, the portal will just use that. It's not going to create another document location. It will only do that if one doesn't exist. So you can use Flow when a record is created to pre-create the document location and the corresponding folder in SharePoint to create your own kind of custom document locations. Now, but however, you can't really change that between different SharePoint sites because it does want to use the SharePoint site, but you can kind of modify the folder structure in that way. Okay, so yeah, anytime anyone says, yeah, we're getting Power Apps portals because of SharePoint, that's kind of a red flag. It's, alarm bells go off and you say, okay, that's great. It does have a SharePoint integration, but let's make sure we understand exactly what we're trying to do with SharePoint so that we don't get into it and just say, yeah, it has SharePoint, you get into it. And it's like, well, it has SharePoint, but it doesn't do exactly what you're looking for. So that's something I always, whenever someone says SharePoint, I always say, we got to dive into those requirements a little bit more because there's not a huge amount of flexibility there. All right, next, along those same lines, Power BI. So this is, half the project want SharePoint, the other half want Power BI. In fact, we get asked for people to, they ask us to build portals implementation whose sole purpose is to expose Power BI to their customers. They think it's just kind of a nicer way of exposing reports rather than exposing them directly through Power BI, the interface itself. So yes, Power BI is integrated with portals. If it was just simply a checkbox like it is with SharePoint, yes, Power BI is integrated with portals, check the box. However, there are things that you have to understand. The first one I always like to remind people about is licensing. The big thing with Power Apps portals is that generally for most implementations, you're probably going to need Power BI embedded, which is a kind of an additional, or it's a separate licensing model outside of the people who are writing the reports. So people are paying for their Power BI Pro licenses to build the reports, and internal people may get that license to view the reports. But when you're talking about what are, in essence, without this licensing, unlicensed users, accessing the report, that's not allowed. The only way you can do that is to publish to web. So within Power Apps portals, there are basically 3 different ways that you can embed something from Power BI. The first one is if you take that report and publish it to web. And that means anyone who knows that URL will see your report. And there's really no filtering based on who the person is. You can do some client-side filtering by passing in parameters as part of the query string, but that's not secure. Anyone who knows anything about how JavaScript works can go in there, remove the filtering, and they're going to see all the data. So the publish to web option is really only an option if that report, if you don't care if everyone can see that report. The next option is if you're using Azure Active Directory authentication. So essentially, if people who are logging into your portal are licensed Power BI users, and they're logging in with the Azure Active Directory account that is licensed for Power BI, then the Power BI reports or dashboards that are shown on the portal will render in the context of that user. That person's a licensed Power BI user, and they'll see whatever they would see if they went to Power BI directly. Again, in a lot of portals implementations, it's not the case that the people who are logging in are licensed users and have Azure Active Directory accounts. So as nice as that is, I don't see a lot of people using that. That's really only for employee self-service as the kind of one of the few cases where that's applicable. So the third option is to use Power BI embedded. So Power BI embedded is, like I said, it's a separate licensing tier. Once you do that, you can embed the report or the dashboards on your portal, and then you can get into security that is based on the based on the person who's logged into the portal. The way that works is that the username or the information about the user in the portal is passed as part of the authentication token to Power BI embedded. So within your report itself, the report needs to be written in such a way that it's using row-level security to filter down based on the username DAX function that gets passed in. So it is possible. You need to make sure your reports are specifically written for the portal and using the row-level security and the username function in order to filter out the records that are specific to the user. So the most common way, the way that it's kind of expected that you would do it on a customer-facing portal, is using Power BI embedded. The Power BI embedded can be a little bit complicated to get right. There's quite a few steps you have to go through. I know I've been on a number of support calls to make sure that you get it done right. And the other thing I would mention is that it does essentially just still throw an iframe of your report on the screen. Whether you feel that that's the best experience or not, that's kind of what it does. So sometimes people develop these giant dashboards, and when you kind of embed them as an iframe on the page, they just is not what they were expecting. So just keep in mind that when you're doing this, it's going to be an iframe that shows up on the page, and you're most likely looking at Power BI embedded. So those are the things to watch out for when people say, "Hey, I just want to use this to drop Power BI on my report or on my portal." Okay, another question here from Jim. AD integrated auth. Are the Power BI user licenses portable? Bring your own license. If guest user, external users have their own Power BI license in their own tenant, would it work for them in my tenant? I don't know the answer to that for Power BI. So if they're guest users, yeah, that's a good question that I don't know the answer to. If you were to log in to Azure Active Directory on the portal using a guest, I don't know if it would respect their Power BI license in the other one. I wish I knew the answer, but I don't know the answer to that one. Sorry. All right. Moving on. Connectors. Power Apps Portal is a Power App, right? That's what I always keep saying whenever people say, "Oh, I want to build a Power App." I'll say, "Well, what kind?" There's 3 types. So along with Model-Driven and Canvas, Power Apps Portals is a Power App. But that doesn't mean that everything that applies to one applies to others. So the thing to understand with Power Apps Portals and along with Model-Driven apps is that they use Dataverse. Dataverse is their data source, whereas with Canvas apps, they use the connector framework. So often people will build out their Power Apps portals and they'll say, "Okay, great, I just want to add a connector in here to talk to SharePoint or a connector to talk to some third-party system." It's like, "Okay, how do we hook in our connector here?" I say, "Well, you don't connect it directly into Portal because the portal just talks to Dataverse. So if you need to do an integration like that, you're looking at either doing something with Power Automate to move the data in. You're looking at maybe doing virtual tables if you want a real-time integration, or you're looking at doing something like a companion app." But portals themselves have no concept of connectors. They don't talk directly to connectors. Maybe that's coming, I don't know, but that's not something that exists right now. So there's just really no, the connector framework, in the same way that with a model-driven app, you can't hook a model-driven app into a connector either. You have to use things like virtual tables or Power Automate to get access to those types of things. So assuming that because there are hundreds of connectors, which are great for use in Power Automate, Canvas apps, that sort of things, assuming that those are available to a portal is, I've seen that done a few times, and can lead to some disappointment and increased estimates for development effort because people realize they kind of have to do some of that themselves versus using Power Automate, or sorry, using the connectors that are available in other parts of the Power Platform. Okay, security. So often, and I had this on a call earlier this week, where people, they'll ask, "Okay, we know the security works like this, but what's going to take to change how the security works?" And the answer is, depending on what type of thing you're trying to secure, The answer could be like, we don't have any ability to secure those things. So table permissions, or as they used to be called, entity permissions, are very flexible. They're a very cool way that you can, on your portal, restrict access to certain things. And that will apply to things like forms and lists and any interfaces you build out using Liquid. However, there are certain features of the product, depending on the template that you pick, that table permissions are not the way that they're secured. If you look at a web role, when you're looking at a web role, there are many different types of permissions that can be associated. Table permissions are one, but there's also permissions that have to do with knowledge base and blogs and ideas and web page access control rules. So not every aspect of your portal is as flexible as the table permissions model. So again, if you're looking at ideas, if you're looking at knowledge base, those are areas where if you look in your portal management app, you don't see the source code for how ideas work. Those are built in ASPX templates, in MVC, built directly into the portal code. So yes, you can build your own interfaces using Liquid to show ideas. Nothing's going to stop you from doing that. If you set up table permissions, the ideas, you can get them to show. However, if someone then goes and tries to search on ideas, the search functionality, which does the security trimming, is going to be based on the out-of-the-box way that you can secure ideas, the way you can secure knowledge base, all these different things. The search capabilities are going to be based on how those out-of-the-box permissions work and not necessarily based on how table permissions work. So you have to kind of consider, well, maybe you don't need search. If you don't need search, then great, maybe you turn search off, and then you don't have to worry about people finding records in other ways. But just always consider that what you're going down is the road of security through obscurity. So that is, it's not that someone can't access it, it's like, well, they probably won't be able to get to it because I don't give them a link. In a lot of cases, that's fine. We have this conversation all the time with our clients, is that, are you just trying to hide things because there's too many things and you're just trying to target stuff for your audience? Or is it that if someone saw this, we'd all get fired? And most often it's just like, well, there's 50 things on the site and we know that they only care about 2 of them. So we'll just show the 2. But if they got a link to their, like, no one really cares. It doesn't really matter. In that case, security through obscurity, great. It's not even security. It's just user experience. But if it's like, yeah, if someone like got access to that page, like we would all get thrown in jail, well, then probably security through obscurity is not the direction you want to go. So understanding how the security works, and I always kind of, as I'll be a pessimist in these cases where people say, well, can we do that? I'm like, I'm going to assume not, and then maybe we can figure out a way of doing it. But there isn't a ton of flexibility in terms of like, how can you secure ideas? There are certain web roles and there are certain ways you can do it. But like, if those ones don't work the way that you want, it's not like you're like, okay, well, we'll just change the code to do that. That's just not something you can do, especially if you're trying to use some of the out-of-the-box features like search. All right. This next one here is everyone's favorite topic, and the one that does lead to a lot of problems when people don't understand how licensing works. And sometimes they'll get into, they'll be done a project and they'll be like, okay, now we just got to get the licenses for our portal, and then you explain to them how it works, and then they start crying because it's like, oh, that's not going to work. Like that we can't afford that, or that doesn't make any sense, or whatever. So it's very important that licensing, understanding the licensing, that is from the outset of the project. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy. Estimating how many external logins you're going to have every month is not a simple task, but it is important that you understand that people who are internal to the organization that owns the portal must be licensed through the Power Apps plans. So let's say you want to create a portal for your internal employees, and you're like, well, they don't log in that often, so I'll just give them, they'll just use the external logins. That's going to work in theory. Like, technically it's going to work. You can't really stop someone from creating an account. But if you ever get audited, that's going to be bad news, because the way the licensing terms are is that if you work for that organization, you must use the Power Apps per app or per user licensing. You can't use external licenses for those people. For external users, it's important to know that that is licensed per login per month. Now, a login is, every time you log in, you're essentially getting a 24-hour pass, and any logins within that 24-hour don't incur additional licenses. But if someone logs in every day, every month, that will cost you anywhere from 28 to 31 licenses, because each one of those will count as one, depending on the number of days in that month. So there's no technical enforcement. There's nothing stopping you from breaking some of these rules yet. Will that ever come? Well, who knows? I mean, we went years without having team member licensing enforced. Well, now it's coming, and we see a lot of people who get sad because they base their business on the fact that they could get these cheap $5 team member licenses that could just do whatever, and now they can't. And now what are they going to do, right? They built their business on this platform, and they can't use it because their licenses went from $5 to $100. So obviously, we never recommend anyone do anything that's contrary to the licensing. So it's important that you understand the nuances, because there's really no way you can't just try to see if it works. If it does work, that's still not a guarantee that is according to the rules. So it's important that you understand how licensing works to avoid a potential disastrous launch where you realize that there are, you're vastly under licensed and now have to pay a lot more for the solution that you didn't realize that you would have to pay. So very important that everyone is on the same page with regards to licensing and how that works. Okay, next one here. Oh, skipped one. Low code, no code. So yes, Power Apps Portals has no /low code components. That's how you might see it marketed. That's how you might see it sold. But that doesn't mean that everything is possible without code. People will often be surprised as says, yes, we can do that, but it's going to involve some code. And they say, well, I thought this was low code. That doesn't mean that absolutely everything is possible without code. Keep in mind that portals in the world of Power Apps, portals is it's closely tied to model-driven apps, not Canvas apps. So within Canvas apps, you kind of got that pixel perfect drag and drop. You got a lot more flexibility with how it looks and how it feels. But the trade-off is with portals and model-driven apps, you can build pretty high data usage, scalable apps very quickly. So there's kind of the trade-off between the two. Canvas has all the connectors, model-driven apps portals are built on Dataverse. So don't assume that you are just going to get into Power Apps portals, you're going to be able to do absolutely anything you want without write any code. Yeah, so just, I would say, don't believe all the marketing and sales hype about low code or no code. Yes, absolutely. We build lots of portals that don't involve any code, but just it depends on the requirements. All right, we've got another question here. Will you speak about strictly anonymous access and what licensing is necessary for that? Yeah, great question. So with strictly anonymous, the licensing model is pretty simple. It's based on page views. So you buy page views, and every time someone accesses any page on your portal, well, pretty much any pages, there's a few exceptions like login page, and there's a few resources that don't technically count. But just assume that anytime they're seeing a page, they're using one of those or anonymous page views. So really, there's kind of three types of users who can log into a portal or view a portal. You've got your external authenticated, internal authenticated, and then you got the anonymous. And so those are licensed purely on page views, and there's a bucket of page views. I think they come in groups of 100,000 page views, and so that's how you get them. That's how they're licensed for strictly anonymous people. Okay. Understand that, and I talked about this with security, but it's not just security, that some features aren't as flexible. As I mentioned earlier, there are some features that were built out in C# code as part of the portal project that you have zero control over in terms of changing any of that code. So you might like the idea that there is a forum, and so you start using discussion forums, and you say, well, yeah, this works great, but I want to change all the stuff about it. Like, there's a good chance that that is simply not possible. So you have to think of some of these things like blogs, ideas, knowledge-based forums as they are like an off-the-shelf, you buy it and you use it the way it's meant, So those are the big ones. Those are the big ones that come with the different templates. Those are all based on the Dynamics templates and not just the kind of the starter Power Apps portal template. But just know that if someone says, hey, I want a blog, say, yeah, it has a blog. And then you have to kind of figure out what are the specific features that they're going to use in that blog. But if they say, oh, I don't like the, I don't like the way that works, can we change it? There's a good chance the answer is no. Usually, if you need to change anything with those ones, you're getting into writing JavaScript to change the look and feel of things. But in terms of the actual functionality, that's pretty tough. You're often just looking at re-implementing. So for example, with knowledge base, we've built out portals where there's a complete custom rendering of knowledge base articles. There's a complete custom search of knowledge base articles. So yeah, we did something that was completely different, but we basically re-implemented knowledge base and it had no resemblance to the one that comes out of the box. So yeah, you can re-implement, and now that we have web API, you can do a lot of the interactions like with knowledge base where you're rating things, or with ideas where you're voting up and down. You can do some of those things now that we have web API, but you're not getting a ton of value out of the box product, you're just redoing it yourself. So knowing which areas are flexible, and generally the flexible ones, you're looking for things that are using web templates, you're looking for things that use forms or lists. Those are the ones where you're going to get a lot more flexibility. If you can't find a page, and so for example, one would be ideas, like you're not going to see all the web pages associated with ideas. If you can't see those pages, it probably means they're locked down in the source code behind. So yeah, question here. We originally provisioned a portal without knowledge base. Is it easy to add after the fact? So the only portal that doesn't have knowledge base is the starter portal. And so the starter portal is the one that's not based on Dynamics, because the knowledge base is part of the customer service module of Dynamics. So is it easy to add after the fact? It depends on your definition of easy, but it is possible. What you essentially have to do is there are specific customizations and solutions that are required to get the knowledge base to work. So what we would generally recommend in those cases is install one of the portals that does have it. And that's pretty much any template other than starter. So you'd be looking at, you'd need to make sure that the instance that you're pointing at is a Dynamics instance, otherwise we wouldn't have knowledge base. But if your Dataverse instance is a Dynamics instance, then what you do is you install one of the other templates. So customer self-service, community, or partner would probably be the most likely ones. You install one of those, that gets the solutions in your environments. You'll get a second portal, which you can get rid of. But what that does is it gets those solutions installed. And then what you do is you take the web pages that are associated with the knowledge articles or the knowledge base, and rather than them say, let's say you installed the community portal, you just reparent those to point at with your custom portal, because the underlying code base is the same for all the portals. You just need the solutions and you need the web files and stuff associated with that to get it to work. So by installing another portal, that will get you the data and it will get you those solutions installed, and then you just take the pages associated with knowledge base and point them at your existing portal. All right. Speaking of those templates, there seems to be sometimes some confusion about, like, well, how much effort does it take to turn on a portal, right? Like there's already a community portal, there's already a customer self-service portal, there's already a partner portal. Like I just install one of those and off I go, right? The answer is like wrong. Like that's, that almost never happens. There is sample data in there. I don't know if we've ever run into a customer that just wants to use all the stuff out of the box. There's probably features in there that you don't want turned on. So like as our kind of even our base project, we look at it, it's a couple of weeks of work just to take a portal from scratch and start looking at the proper ALM process, theming, removing all the demo content, configuring and customizing just the few tweaks that they need. So think of the templates as they're a place to start, but they are certainly not a finish line. And so if you're assuming that, hey, I just need a community portal and I'm just going to turn it on and a few hours later I'll be on my way. Yeah, if you've done it 100 times and you don't need anything changed, maybe, but the reality is that that's a very rare situation. So yeah, the templates are great, but just they are a starting point, not a finish line. ALM. I don't know how many times I've been asked this question, but it's a lot. You know, where's the, I finished my portal in dev. Where's the button to push this to production? And if you can find that, please let me know. I've been looking for it for 10 years now. And that's because it doesn't exist. So moving the stuff, and we've had a whole session on ALM, so I don't want to kind of dive too much into this, but ALM is not a simple thing. We find this with a lot of partners who get into their first portal one, they do it in dev as they're supposed to, and they don't realize that once they get everything ready, that moving that to another environment is not trivial. There's lots of different ways you can do it, but none of them are an easy button. There's always, you know, work involved in doing that. So there's lots of, you know, there's different options, but just know that if you're following proper, you know, development practices by not doing it in production, there's going to be a point where you have to move that between environments. And it's tricky because you're not moving solutions, although a solution might be part of it. You're also moving the data that's in your Dataverse environment, and that's a tricky thing to do. So don't overlook the fact that an ALM or moving the data between the different environments is going to be a non-trivial step of your portal's implementation. Okay, I think that was number 9. Last one here. The thing to remember is that, again, I love Power Apps portals. I'm a fan of Microsoft, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other options. And that doesn't mean that Power Apps portals is always going to be the best fit. There are other portals technologies specifically for Dynamics and Dataverse and Power Platform. There's Alexa CRM, which is built on top of WordPress. There's the Portal Connector, which actually just was acquired in the last couple of days, which is built on top of Sitefinity. There's this new one that I've seen called Externable, which is a portal technology built directly on portals, or sorry, directly on Dynamics. So it's a new product meant specifically for building portals on Dynamics. So there are other options. So don't be afraid to explore those other options. We've used all of, I've used Portal Connector, I've used Alexa CRM. There are reasons that those products exist. So yes, consider Power Apps portals. It could be the fit for you, but it very well might not be the fit for you. So don't be afraid to look at other options. And you know, if you're getting into something where you expect to write a lot of custom server-side code, you might want to look at something like Portal Connector. One of the big requirements that we run into that gets us to look at other things would be, hey, I want to have a really nice corporate site that needs to have a lot of, you know, fancy little widgets on it, and it's all about marketing and branding and all that sort of stuff. Oh, and there's a contact us form on it that we want in Dynamics. It's like, well, Power Apps Portals is not an enterprise content management system. So to pick a platform that's meant for interacting with Dataverse simply because you can do a contact us form very easily, but what you're giving up is all the features that you'd want as part of a content management platform, that's usually the wrong choice. So we use WordPress a lot for our clients that need a true, like a real website with content management, and you know, it's got all the widgets and all that sort of stuff. That's an excellent platform. And so if they have basic requirements where, hey, we want people to be able to sign up for newsletters and add to marketing lists or contact us, Alexa CRM is a great choice. Portal Connector is a .NET, is built in .NET with Sitefinity. So again, Sitefinity is a mid to enterprise level content management system. It has the functionality that you'd expect out of a real content management system. So if that's what you need and you're just needing basic functionality on top of like basic, you know, hey, I need them to submit a form, or like even a simple help desk. If you have a simple help desk and you want it, and you already have a WordPress site or you already have Sitefinity, look at one of these options, because rather than spinning up a brand new web property, it might be easier just to embed it into something that you already have. So just remember that there's other options, and don't get pigeonholed into Power Apps portals because it might not always be the right option. All right. Next call. Because of those silly Americans who do Thanksgiving 2 months late, we are pushing. We've kind of done this last year as well. We typically skip the call at the end of December because people are got better things to do than listen to me during the holidays. So we're just pushing our next call, what would normally be the end of December. We're going to push it into early December, and then that will be the last call for the year. So that would be Thursday, December 9th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. By that time, the time will change, so it's a little different UTC. It's a little different for me because we're special and don't do daylight savings. So that will be 2 o'clock Central, 3 o'clock Eastern. That will be the time of our next call. Again, thank you to the folks at MS Dynamics World. And if anyone else has any more questions, thank you, Jim, for all the questions. It makes my job more fun when people are asking. I do appreciate your ALM process of Control-C, Control-V, repeat as necessary. I'd be lying to say if that's not one of the options that gets used from time to time here as well. So beyond that, again, thank you to Jason and MS Dynamics World. And I will, I got time here for any other questions if there are some.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I'm just looking through these questions. Yeah, thanks, Jim, for all the feedback as we went there. Does anything else ring true for anyone else on the line who's been hearing it? This is a great presentation, Nick. It's great to hear all this candid sort of recounting of your experiences and the kind of conversations you have with firms.
Yeah, unfortunately, we get brought in quite a lot to be the fixer at the end where something's gone poorly. But again, because portals are so kind of different from the rest of the Power Platform, often we engage with partners who have decided that it's just not worth it's not worth the hassle. So there's a question here about, is there a good source for licensing info? We found the help. Really, the only source is the licensing guide. The licensing isn't really, to be honest, that the concepts aren't complicated. It's taking those concepts and applying them to real life, which is confusing. And the toughest thing is if you say how many external users are going to log into your portal every month. That's a difficult thing to guess at. Once you do that, it's pretty simple. But trying to guess as to how many people are going to log into your portal over the span of a month so that you can guess as to how many licenses you want to buy, that's tricky. So there was a question about, have we ever implemented a portal with a shopping basket? The answer is yes. Typically, historically, those were done with a companion app, because in order to build a true shopping cart experience where you're adding things to cart and it's just that kind of the e-commerce experience that you're looking for, we've traditionally just done that using a bunch of client-side code and then interacting directly with Dataverse through a companion app. I would suspect nowadays we could probably get a lot further using the Portals Web API. We haven't had that requirement since the Portals Web API went to GA, but e-commerce was something that was part of ADX Studio, doesn't exist as part of the current platform, so it does essentially involve some custom code, especially if you're talking about payment processing. And payment processing is something we've done quite a bit as well. Typically, those solutions are using companion apps, although we have done some, we did one event registration module that did involve payment, and in that case, we were able to do it just with plugins, so we didn't necessarily need a companion app, but yeah, it's essentially kind of a custom web development job. Question, will Power Automate and Portals eventually work together without using the web API? The answer is yes. I hope you're not going to ask me when, because I don't know the answer to that. But I do think that there's a desire within the Microsoft product group to transition, maybe not even transition away from web API, or sorry, transition away from classic workflows, but just to add the ability to call flows as well, to Power Automate flows. So I don't think that's, I mean, I didn't see it in the release notes. I know when I ask about it, it's something that's on their radar. So I don't have any timelines, but I think to answer your question specifically, will it eventually? I would say the answer is yes. Okay. I guess last call for any questions. Otherwise, we will leave it at that. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Hope to see you December 9th. If anyone has any particular topics that you'd like to see covered, please do let me know. That's one of the things I struggle with the most, is coming up with topics. So please let me know what you'd like to see. and we'll see if we can get it covered in the near future here.
Great, thanks, Nick. And yeah, thanks to everyone in the audience. Appreciate the questions, appreciate you showing up and attending. We'll see you in December. And with that, let's conclude today's event.